Hello, I think we are live, so we can get started. Welcome to this discussion of Bonnie Garmis's Lessons in Chemistry. I'm just so glad that you're here, that we can talk and learn together about this wonderful text. For those who I haven't met yet, my name is Professor Chris Hedlund. I teach here at Notre Dame. I say here, I'm currently sitting in my office in O'Shaughnessy. Shout out to OSHAG. I'm in a relatively new program called the Sheedy Family Program in Economy, Enterprise, and Society. So this wonderful program serves students who have interests in both something in business and something in liberal arts. So it's very interdisciplinary. My own background is my PhD is in English. I'm trained as a 19th century literary historian. And so my role in the classroom is largely helping students see how things like literature and literary methods like close reading or dialogue uh, can contribute to students' personal and professional growth. I love what I do, and I'm so grateful that I'm getting a chance to share a glimpse of that with you tonight. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I should say that's my paid labor. I'm also a full-time mom to a rambunctious toddler. Yeah, I'm just so glad that you took the time to be here with me tonight. I'd love to know kind of who's in the room. I don't get to see you with this webinar style, which is a shame, but I'm hoping that through the chat, we can kind of be in dialogue with one another. So some of you I know are in this room who have been participating all along with um, a online forum through Facebook with the Notre Dame Women Connect Shared Read program. So I'd love if you participated in the shared read and were contributing either to the online Facebook group or you were in a local discussion group, it would be amazing if you could in the chat just be like, hi, it's me, like share who you are and like maybe what your graduation year was or like, hey, tuning in from whatever your location was, just so we can kind of warm up the chat, see where people are coming in from. I see Aaron. Hi, Aaron. I know also some of you have been watching with the Think ND series that I've been hosting. I've been interviewing cool experts on the history of women's labor and women's literature. Some of you I know have been uh, following that series. So if you've been following along the Think ND series, I would love for you to join the chat and let us know, hey, where you're from, your year. And then fun group, I'm seeing them already kind of jumping into the chat. There's students here who have been taking an undergraduate course with me called Women's Work. And so these students have been sitting every Tuesday, Thursday morning to talk with me about literature, about women's work. So kind of thought within the context of the course, I'm going to draw some insights from the course for you as part of our conversation about lessons in chemistry. So just to give you a little bit of background, we thought about women's work in three senses of that word. So the first was a history of the idea of gendered separate spheres. Like, how did we get the idea that some kinds of labor, say care work, domestic chores, teaching, are properly the concern of women, and other forms of labor, business, scholarly pursuits are coded masculine. So that's the first sense. The second one was thinking about work as in works of literature. So throughout the course, we read popular contemporary fiction about working women, like Lessons in Chemistry, got my copy here ready to go, like Lessons in Chemistry, and probed how do fictional representations of working women relate to women's actual lived experiences. And then third, we used women's work as a starting place for purpose-driven career discernment. So students taking up questions like, what will be meaningful work for me? How do I want to balance career and family in my life? And we saw gender then as an always present variable in those kinds of real life conversations. I know for me personally, this is the first time I was teaching that course, an absolute joy to teach. I'm grateful to the Office of Digital Learning for giving me a grant to help develop the course, for Sheedy, as always, for giving me the freedom in order to like think these kinds of big ideas alongside students. And then last but not least, to the students, it's just been an absolute honor to teach with you this semester, think alongside you. And I'm grateful that you're all here tonight to help converse with the alumni too. Okay, speaking of students, so one student from Women's Work, Junior Grace Lynch, volunteered to signed on to be willing to be co-host with me tonight. I'm so grateful, Grace, that you were willing. So I thought maybe, Grace, you could just introduce yourself and maybe share like a favorite part of the course for you in your student experience.
Sure. So thank you guys so much for joining. It's amazing to see that there's 80 people in the podcast and the live right now. That's amazing. So my name is Grace. As Dr. Headland said, I'm a junior majoring in political science. I have minors in public service and poverty studies. I live in Ryan Hall, Go Brah. I can see some Ryan alumni in the chat right now. I'm from the state of Illinois. And then one of my favorite aspects of the course came from the informational interviews. So one of our tasks was to take two women who volunteered their time to be interviewed and go through and see where our interests lied, what questions we could have about them, and talk to them. Both the women I interviewed were in the field of law, very different. And so I got to ask them for advice, ask them about their career path, ask them about either having a dog or having kids, however they chose to live their life. And it was just so inspirational. And then with those interview transcripts, we made poetry out of it. So it really taught me the importance of paying attention to words. Really cool exercise.
Thanks so much, Grace. Yeah, that I know there's people who are I can recognize from the chat who I know volunteered for those informational interviews. So again, what a gift to be able to have the alumni community rally around these students. We really benefited from that portion of the course. I know I did, Grace, and I think I can speak for all the students. We really valued that. Should we? I'm seeing some Sheedy alums. Hello, Sheedy alums. Let's talk lessons in chemistry. So I'm going to try to bring a little bit of the conversations we had in the course to bear on the discussion that we're going to have for the next 42 minutes or so. How I'm organizing, or how Grace and I are organizing tonight. In the lead up for tonight's event, I asked you, some of you, people who were on the Shared Read Facebook group, conversations I had with alumni one-on-one, certainly with the students in the class, like to generate a list of questions that they might want to think through with the book. So Grace was volunteered kind of fireside chat style to tee me up with those questions. And then I'll share some thoughts in response to that. The goal here is to give you little snapshots of multiple different conversations, as opposed to just giving you like one lecture about a single topic related to the book. So hopefully we'll touch on a lot of people's interests. Grace and I have 10 questions on our list, but we hope that we don't get to all of them, because the ideal thing here is that you're either in the chat, or you can see along the bottom of your screen, there's a question and answer, like a Q&A button. If you hit that button, you can submit questions to us live that I will then respond to. It's a little scary for me, but challenge me. That's a good thing. I welcome your questions. Like, one of the cool things about doing an event live as compared to just like listening to a podcast or something, and some of you will listen to it later, no shade, but if you're here live, like, what a gift to be able to discuss something in community, right? We've talked in the class a lot about the way texts bring people together. So I would love for this to be a conversation where you're asking the questions that are on your mind and letting me answer them. In addition to that Q&A feature, the chat itself, like, I hope we can keep the chat hot. So if you're listening to something and you have a response, like, no response is too small. So get there in the chat and like, let us know what's on your mind. Comment, oh yeah, I thought so too, or oh, here's a good example of that if you have your book around. The students, besides Grace's classmates, are in charge of manning, or I should say womanning. We were all women in the class, womanning the chat. And so this is taking the place of their final exam, make them work for it, helping you out, responding to your things in the chat. All right. So before we jump into questions, I would love to know, kind of just gauge your responses to the book, people who have read it, who are in the room. So I had Kelsey Forey, who's our Think ND mastermind behind this event, is going to queue up a poll question. And I would love for you to respond to just let me know, like, did you like the book if you read it? There's a few different responses. Fast. Good. I think you can see the chat, you can see it on your end, but we've got 5 stars from a lot of people. About 51% said 5 stars, 33% at like mostly yes, mostly you liked it. A about 6% of people had either mixed feelings, man, not my favorite. A few people who haven't read yet. I'm gonna warn you, we're gonna do a few spoilers. So when if we start talking about the ending, maybe just like la 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 to yourself so that we don't ruin anything for you. But yeah, good. This is helpful to me. One of the things that, I mean, literary study has a lot of things going for it and has enhanced people's appreciation of texts in a lot of ways. But one thing that we're guilty of is often hierarchizing intellectual response to text above emotional response. And that's something that I always kind of try to counteract. Like, I think it's important to acknowledge first, like, well, how is it that you felt about the book? And then we can probe into, okay, why did you feel that way? So the questions that Grace and I have teed up or thought through together first have to do with emotional responses. I'd be curious to, if you're willing in the chat, like, if you said you liked it, what did you like about it? If you didn't like it, what didn't you like? If you were mixed, I would love to hear in the chat, like, sort of likes and dislikes. And then Grace and I will start talking through kind of some responses that we heard in advance about these kinds of things. Grace, do you want to tee up first question?
Perfect. Let's go ahead with the first question. So the first question does relate a lot to liking the book or not liking the book. So this speaks to not liking the book. It seems like one of the critiques of the book was centered on believability. One alumni reader wrote that I found it annoying / implausible that Elizabeth was so exceptional at everything she did without effort or training. And then another person wrote, quote, the TV show is where everything fell apart for me. A live TV show with no rehearsals. Where's all the prep time? This is the worst kind of plot device. So, Dr. Headland, what should we make of these implausibilities?
Good. Yeah, so I'd be curious. I'm trying to read through in the chat whether we're going to get to things we like in a bit, but we thought we'd start with critique, whether this is something that people who are in the room also felt. But going through the Facebook group, going through in class, it seemed like when there were critiques, it was often around believability. And so I think if you had these concerns, my like first question back to you would be like, sort of a self-interrogation of why do I expect this text to be believable? And so one kind of simple answer I guess I could give to this question is to say, like, well, it's fiction. Like, of course it's not believable, right? Like, you're concerned about a TV show rehearsal. Like, there's a talking dog or, a thinking human thinking like dog. Of course it's not believable. So, just enjoy the ride and stop questioning whether it can really happen. But I don't think that kind of response is particularly helpful. So instead, I want to talk for a couple of minutes about the relationship between realism and romance. And I'm using the term romance here with a capital R. So not romance as in about love, but romance as in something larger than life. And so pulling us back a little bit, we're gonna do a teeny history of the novel here. So just think for a second, like, have you ever questioned why a novel is called a novel, right? The word suggests something new. And in fact, the novel is something new. So today, novels are so ubiquitous that it can be hard for us to remember how recent they were in sort of the history of the written language. So novels only began in English, depends on the scholar you ask, but between like 1600 and 1800. And so one question that you might ask, and maybe this is one for the chat, it's like a little pop quiz question. What do you think people read for like pleasure, fun before there were novels? Uh-huh. Got lots of votes. Uh-huh.
A lot of Bible.
Yeah, uh-huh, exactly. Lots of Bible. Yeah, and that's right. So lots of religious texts, Bible, sermons, tracts. Somebody put poetry in. That's right. Plays, yes, going to see plays. Certainly that was something. Absolutely. But the one that maybe hasn't come up yet, that is very relevant to this story is epics. So like thinking about epic poetry or epics as a form of narrative. So epics are romantic, capital R. So we're following characters who are almost like types in these larger than life plots as they're jumping from one big adventure to the next. So think about something like classic The Odyssey or the Iliad, but more familiar probably to most people, Star Wars is an epic, right? Nobody's watching Star Wars and being like, how do those characters have such good teeth? They never brush their teeth, right? Like we don't expect that Jabba the Hutt's like brushing his teeth in between scenes, right? That would be silly. We're jumping from one big event to the next. That's what defines like in the epic form, the romance. So the novel, when it entered the scene in like in the English language in like the 16 to 1800s, we're starting to introduce something that scholars call formal realism. So novels are new in representing characters' everyday sensory experiences. We're on a 24-hour time clock now. Characters have last names. We're by the mid 1800s, we have characters who have interior lives that we're following. All of this is, as opposed to that romance jumping from one big event to the next, is realist. This everyday sensory experiences. So when you're reading stories, when we're reading stories, one of the things we can pay attention to is the balance or the jump back and forth between realism and romance, right? So think about something like Harry Potter. When are you at having big event, larger than life events, romance? And when are you following some very angsty preteens with their like circle drama, peer drama, realism, right? That those tensions between those are a source of entertainment. There's a source often of humor too. We bring different expectations to each plot line, depending on which of those two buckets we're putting it in, realism versus romance. So to tie this back around to lessons in chemistry, one of the cool and challenging things about lessons in chemistry as a text is that it mixes realism and romance. So in general, this is a realist text. We're following a character in their everydayness. We can imagine them inhabiting the 24-hour time clock, but we get larger than life events thrown in. So destroying a kitchen to make a lab, a dog that speaks in full human sentences, somebody who is randomly discovered because she's pursuing her daughter's lunch and then becomes a TV star, right? Like those kinds of larger than life things. Then we're in the bucket of romance. So for me, I don't mind as much that I don't have as many questions about believability because I'm like, oh, that's just doing something different. We're in the romance bucket now. Um, yeah. Grace, do you want to grab the second one?
Sure. I was just looking through the chat and it looked like a lot of the unbelievability came from the humor, and which was enjoyable for a lot of people, it seemed like.
Hmm.
So that's an interesting thing to consider as well. Like, is there a benefit from having unbelievability in like how the reader is going to consume it?
Yeah, good, good. We can talk about humor, and then maybe we can come back to thinking a little bit more. I do want to talk about the ending when it comes to believability, but let's talk about humor a bit because I do see a lot of folks in the chat who are mentioning humor as something that they like, and that's amazing. I'm also seeing a couple comments, people who have interest in the ending. So yeah, we'll get to the ending in a second. But thinking about humor, yeah, to me, this is one of the joys of this text, is that um, the we can have something that is such a serious topic, right? Thinking about like sexism and misogyny in the workplace, not at all a light topic. And yet there's this whimsy to it, right? Like this one of the reviewers I remember called it an utter delight, right? And usually I don't associate the words utter delight with sexism in the workplace, right? So how do these two things, how do they square together? And I think that's part of the sort of masterclass of the text. I think usually when people are asked, what do you like about a book? Our first instincts are the plot and the characters. And certainly I'm seeing in the chat that Elizabeth Zott has a lot of fans out there, me too. But I think I would argue that it's the narrative voice that often makes or breaks your relationship with a text. And certainly for me, that was true here. So to just tease out a couple of details about that narrative voice together as a group. This is gonna flashbacks to high school English. Third person omniscient narration. So that means we have a narrator who's talking about characters with he, she, they. It's not an I narrator. Omniscient, that means that they can see into all characters' thoughts and feelings. So their perspective isn't limited to just what one character knows. That does not mean that omniscient does not mean a narrator has to show us equally every character's perspective. They can be selective, and that's a lot of times where the drama comes from. But they can show us parts of each. And a great example, I saw a lot of fans of 630. 630 is a great example of like, yeah, we're inside a different character's head than Elizabeth's, right? It's a side note to that the narrator is not the author, and those two things shouldn't be conflated. So we can talk about what like the text is saying, what the narrator is saying. We don't know necessarily that that's what the author believes. So in this text, we have a narrator who has a very different voice than Elizabeth. And I thought we could look at a passage together. Let me see if I can, let's see, I know I can share my screen. Let me bring it up so that you can follow along. Okay, are folks looking at my screen now? Okay, good. Oh, here I brought in a picture of the students. There's the students in the class. Hooray, our class. But here's the an example. These are the very opening lines of texts. Always important to pay attention to what are the opening lines because it does so much work for our relationship to the whole book. So this passage reads, back in 1961, when women wore church dresses and joined garden clubs and drove legions of children around in seatbeltless cars without giving it a second thought, back before anyone even knew there'd be a 60s movement, much less one that its participants would spend the next 60 years chronicling, back when the big wars were over and the secret wars had just begun, and people were starting to think fresh and believe everything was possible, the 30-year-old mother of Madeline Zott rose before dawn every morning and felt certain of just one thing. Her life was over. Despite that certainty, she made her way to the lab to pack her daughter's lunch. I'd love to see in the chat, like, how would you describe, like, share some observations. What are you noticing about this passage or about the tone of this passage?
I can say while people are responding, the last sentence is just so strong. Her life was over. It's just so over dramatic. Sometimes I feel like that. It's final season right now for Sins of Notre Dame. So I'm like, oh, I have a final. I'm just not going to make it through. And so I just can relate to her so much in that over dramatization of just like, but then it goes back to normal. Like it's just a part of the humor.
Yeah, good. Yeah, good. And I see people in the chat that are backing you up there. The like, I think the I'm seeing people Anne Marie put rye in. That's a word that stands out to me. Um the I'm looking like dramatic and humorous, um, mix of light and heavy. Good. Funny, witty. Yes, good. So the subject matter is something it's different than the voice entirely, right? Like I love the line, back before anyone knew there'd even be a 60s movement, much less one that its participants would spend the next 60 years chronicling. Like it's making fun a little bit, right? Like it's not in a mean way, not in a critical way, but just in sort of an appreciation of humans way. And we see that throughout this text. I'll stop sharing my screen so that you're seeing me again. We see that this throughout the text, right? That there's a narrator who has kind of a warm, ironic distance from things. Again, wry, I think, is a good word there. And that is different than Elizabeth. So I'm struck by how many times during the text, Elizabeth says of herself, I'm always serious. Or they say, you know, she didn't joke, she didn't smile. The producers are asking her to smile, and she says, I'm not going to do that. So Elizabeth should not be confused with the narrator. And part of the reason I think that this text speaks to so many of us or so appealing to us is because we have this like witty, wry, warm narrator who's speaking alongside then Elizabeth, who provides that pricklier version of what it means to be a woman in the world. The contrast between them, I think, is why this book works. We might want to talk about the TV show more in a little bit, but I think this is one of the oversights in the TV show, that we don't have this narrator. And so they have to then, they've chosen to soften Elizabeth to make her a little bit warmer, a little bit funnier. And I think we lose what makes Elizabeth so distinctive because we can't conflate those two roles. We need those two to be in juxtaposition to each other. So yeah, I love the narrative voice, big fan. I'll stop there.
I feel like kind of jumping to the next question related to juxtaposition. Throughout the book, we had a huge focus on Elizabeth Zott. Then at the ending, we had a rich, long-lost relative show up at the Hastings, fires all the supposedly bad people, and promises to give Elizabeth this unlimited funding and ultimate freedom to pursue her own research. This kind of goes back to unbelievability, but is this a satisfying ending?
Yeah, good. I'm curious in the chat. I saw a few people already commented on the ending. Grace, thanks for then asking this. I think the ending, like I said in general, I didn't have critiques about believability, but there's one exception to that rule. And that is what I call the mysterious benefactor plot. My husband and I, the first time I read this, I listened to it as an audiobook when it first came out with my husband on a road trip. He's a chemist. I'm a 19th century literary scholar. So we both had our bones to pick. For those who want to know, he was concerned because he's like, no chemist would actually call things like sodium chloride. We would just be annoyed with that person. Why are they trying to make her seem smart by naming chemicals by their like chemistry name? Fair point. My concern as I was reading, so I was really loving it. And then when we got to the end, I was like, I feel like I'm reading something or listening to something out of the 19th century. Like, I feel like I'm reading a Charles Dickens novel. And like that sense of this as Dickensian, like a characteristic of Charles Dickens just stuck with me. And so I decided as I was prepping for the course to like try to kind of follow up on this thread a little bit more. And I don't know if any of you have read Charles Dickens at some point, but I asked generative AI, if any of you have questions about generative AI and how we use it in this course, I asked generative AI to generate for me a list of 10 of like the most common plot tropes within Charles Dickens fiction. And I'm going to bring that list up on the screen here so that you can see it. Let's see. And I'll read it too in case people are listening to this podcast later. Let me see if I can make it big. Good. Okay. Top 10 plot tropes in Charles Dickens fiction. 1, the orphaned or abandoned protagonist. 2, a rags to riches transformation. 3, hidden or mistaken identities, characters whose true identities are concealed and then revealed in dramatic plot twists. Eccentric secondary characters, so memorable supporting characters with unique names like Mrs. Gamp and exaggerated traits. 5, institutional critique, pointed criticism of social institutions, including religious institutions. Coincidental connections, seemingly random characters turn out to be connected in complex ways. Redemption narratives, fog and weather as metaphor. Rowing out on the early morning, anyone? Class divides and social commentary. And then last but not least, Victorian sentimentality, emotional scenes designed to evoke strong feelings. So in class, we went through and we identified, and some people are guessing in the chat, we indeed found all 10 of these Dickensian plot tropes present within this mysterious benefactor plotline in the novel. Now, what do we do about that? My first instinct was to complain, to be like, well, this is a realist story. Why do we, when we need to resolve it at the end, turn to this larger than life, kind of over the top 19th century cliche to go about it? Like, we don't need the realm of abandoned orphans and hidden identities in order to like have this be meaningful. But I shared this in class, and this is an example of why teaching is so amazing because students help me change my mind all the time, and that's learning. I shared this in class, and some students in there, as they were kind of debriefing the class, said things basically like, oh, well, I thought it was good. And now I realize it's stupid. Like they didn't say those exact words, but like that was the gist of it. And I was like, oh no, I've done exactly the opposite of what I want to do. Like I don't want to poo-poo on things that people love. And so perhaps I'm just a contrarian, but like through conversations with students as they were moving towards more critical based on my comments, I was moving towards more generous based on theirs. They had such interesting and important things that were helpful for my thinking. So I'm going to share what they were, the kind of the way they helped redeem this ending for me. And that is that this book, as we were just talking about with the narrator, it mixes whimsy and serious all the time. And in fact, that's why this works. This is why so many people are drawn to this and it's become a bestseller. And the ending continues that. Like we get that happy ending that realism might not permit, right? If we can't, if we're picturing like a realistic world in which Elizabeth Zott would get that happy ending, that's hard. And I think any attempt to go that route, Bonnie Garmus would have run into folks who are like, well, that's not realistic. It wouldn't have actually happened. But if a happy ending can't play out here, where can it? Like, I think there's something so cathartic about watching justice be served. Like, I think about that quote about the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice, right? Like, that want for justice to be served in such a clear-cut way. And so that's one reason or one way that I think that this romantic mysterious benefactor plotline actually does help us in the end. The second, and it would take someone with a lot of money and power to overturn the systems that are in place at Hastings, right? And the other thing I would say is that like the book seemed very aware, self-aware of what it was doing. And the reason that I originally I was like, is the book aware? Like, is Bonnie Garmus thinking about Dickens? Like, because it seems so obvious to me. But the way that she had Mads family tree talk about a fairy godmother, right? Like that exact language of a fairy godmother comes in. It's like, okay, she knows we're in the realm of larger than life of Once Upon a Time when we get to this particular plot line. So that helped me. Yeah, I have come around. I feel like the line, oh, I didn't like the ending is so cliche that like I just don't even like to go there. Like yeah, landing the plane for a book is so hard, right? Because if it's a happy ending, people will critique you as too neat. And if it's a sad ending, people will be like, well, I didn't want a sad ending. How depressing. And if it's ambiguous, people are like, oh, you should have tied all the ends together. You left it too open-ended. So I compliments, I think I've been won over.
I want to shout out a comment in the chat as well from Teresa. She said that I feel like the mysterious benefactor was effective because you were led to believe it was a man, and then at last it was a woman with her own hardship slash history, which is another way of thinking about it as well.
That's lovely. Good. Yeah, absolutely. That does absolutely add to it. Cool. Yeah.
Kind of relating to like thoughtfulness, or this is switching to like more positive, thinking about it, finding the positive lights. A professional reviewer said that the book was what you referred to, Dr. Headland, an utter delight, wry and vibrant. A lot of us in this class, as you just mentioned, did really enjoy the book. It seemed like in the Facebook forum too, they also enjoyed it. But this is a very heavy book with heavy topics about sexism in the workplace, not light at all. So, how is it true that we can enjoy this book that's about something so heavy?
Hmm. Yeah, good. Good. Well, I think I mean, what we already talked about a little bit about the narrator and the role of the narrator in helping us be able to like sort of turn that um lighter, like sort of warm eye on serious topics. I think that's a big part of it. Um, Another thing that's coming to mind is the way that so there's a term that's used within narrative, and this might get a little in the weeds for a second. So if you're like not here for it, just tune out for a sec. But there's a technique called free indirect discourse. So if we're thinking about how people are narrating texts, direct discourse means that we're giving people direct quotes. Chris said, comma, quote, I actually turned out to like the mysterious benefactor plotline, period, end quote. Indirect discourse is reporting what someone says without quoting them. So Chris said that she liked the indirect or she liked the mysterious benefactor plotline in the end. Free and direct discourse is when the third person narration blends with the character's thoughts. And so it strikes me that one of the ways that we're able to bring this um, light and serious together is that the narrator is willing to let us inside different characters' heads who are having different perspectives. And so think about something like 630, right? Like what a role that character plays in the ability for the book to be enjoyable, to feel light at points without being dismissive of Elizabeth's very real pain that in some ways he's witnessing, right? And so our ability to align with different characters' thoughts and feelings in turn, I think is part of what lets us to have this back and forth between light and heavy that makes the book so successful.
Someone said in the chat that like the lightness makes life tolerable, and that like we can follow like her lead in it, even though she's going through these really difficult things, that we can follow how she treats it within the book.
That's great. Neat.
Also speaking to also heavy as well, religion is something that seemed to come up a bit less in this chat. I think this will open the doors though, that the novel seems to be very critical of religion, at least from what we seem to talk about Dr. Headland within the class. So I'm curious, what do you think religion plays within the plot?
Yeah, good. I'm glad this is one's coming up. It's so my own research interest is about religion and literature. So I think about religion when I'm reading a lot. Certainly being at a Catholic university, I know that a lot of folks in our class, and I'm imagining here on the event also are really interested and curious about religion. So I would say like yes, religion gets a bad rap in this text. So we can think about things like the Catholic boys' home where Calvin grew up that turns out to be like a scam. We could think about like when Calvin's mom gets pregnant and she's sent to this Catholic home that takes the baby away from her. Elizabeth's parents are religious frauds, right? Like scamming people for money. So it's interesting because I'm like, this was another moment where I found myself thinking, I've read this before in the 19th century. So the 19th century, like religious fiction in the 19th century was very concerned with religious hypocrisy. So we might think of like maybe a most famous example, someone like Harriet Beecher Stowe talking about in the context of slavery. How can you possibly call yourself a Christian and also enslave people, right? Like it's such a good question, such a live question, a legitimate question. But this also, so that was like a way that critiques of religious hypocrisy were doing really important work in the 19th century. But it also showed up in a less good way in Protestant critiques of Catholicism. So by the end of the 19th century, there was something of a trope to have like the cool Protestant minister who's like wrestling with doubts and isn't really sure if he totally believes in things anymore, compared to this like blindly allegiant or hypocritically conniving Catholics or like evangelical revivalists. Do you see how that maps on to what we've seen here, right? So Wakely, the Protestant manager, is a type. I've seen, as soon as he said to Matt, I have my own secret, I was like, let me guess, he doesn't believe in religion, right? Like he doesn't believe in God. That's a type. It was predictable to me. So the fact that Elizabeth's moral growth or her moral compass comes through this Protestant minister who's discarded organized religion for a focus on just like doing the right thing, being moral, while meanwhile all primarily Catholic institutions are garbage. I'm not here for that. I think if I had one critique of the book, it would be its treatment of religion. I'm all for critiques of religious hypocrisy, but I just think the way it showed up in this book was uncareful. So that's my 2 cents on that. I think again, the contrast between quote true Christian virtue or values that often like slants Protestant compared with like an organized religious dogma that skews Catholic. Yeah, it's a little bit cliche for me. Didn't like that.
It is interesting. Jumping slightly away from the cliche,
Yeah.
there's a comment from Ed that I want to bring out So
Good.
he brings out a part from the book of a quote Elizabeth is giving to Mad for advice. The quote is, "Remember that we don't believe in God, but we respect those who do." And Ed actually tied this to a quote from the past late Pope Francis in a
Mm,
request to an audience in New York. And his quote is that, "If you follow God, please pray for me. And if not, please wish me well." So Ed connects this to it doesn't matter your religious background, there's this type of good doing that we have to do for each other and recognition that the audience you're speaking to may not all come from the same religious background.
yeah, beautiful. Yeah, thanks, Ed. That's really helpful. Love it. That's why the chat. It's perfect. That's why we're here, people, live event. Great. Yeah, I just think I was so grateful to the ways that you all in the class too, Grace, brought in such helpful personal perspectives thinking about this.
I think one
Mm.
more personal perspective that's interesting from the chat is Jane from our class shared that she had like a mixed family growing up. And so it's interesting about like how you learn to tolerate other beliefs. But maybe if you didn't have that, this book shows how you can interact with people who are from religious backgrounds, may not be religious yourself, and try to balance that, which I think is super important at Notre Dame, where we are Catholic, but not every student here is Catholic. So you have to interact with people from different religious backgrounds no matter what.
Mhm. Totally. I'm seeing a question in the chat from Alicia. What would I have written differently? It's a good putting me in my place, like writing's hard. Props to Bonnie Garmus for anything she's written. But would the if the minister would have been Catholic, would that have resolved the issues with the tropes? Um, I think in some ways it would have. That we would have seen then that like within the same denomination we have um uh it can look negative, it can be a source of hypocrisy, it can be a source of conniving dogma, and it can then be a source of kind of moral guidance or truth. So I think that would have been a little more nuanced. Yeah, I think that thinking about like the history of Protestant and Catholicism in the United States, I'm just very cognizant of the ways that Protestantism has historically created a hierarchy where the Protestant faith is the rational one and that Catholicism is less than that. And then certainly evangelical, like revivalists, is part of that too. So I think that would have upset the trope a little bit. Yeah.
Kind of speaking to the fact that there were ministers, there's not just one character. It's not just Elizabeth Stott in this book. There's other people that are involved. So I
Mhm.
want to talk about some other people that really were involved in the novel that I think the TV show might do a good job of highlighting, but it's easy to miss sometimes in the book. So I want to talk about Miss Brask and
Yeah.
Harriet. So what do you think they added to the narrative if you closely read it?
Good. Yeah. Good. And maybe, yeah, I can try to tie in about book versus TV show in the same kind of question. Um, I think it's so great that we have a text that has multiple examples of strong female characters, but that aren't just all 100% likable and perfect, right? Like showing women in their complexity and three different complexities, beautiful. So I think thinking about Miss Frask and Harriet, and I'm going to talk about the book first, so I can talk about the TV show in a bit. Um, I'm struck by like the theme of the importance of female friendship, right? So Miss Frask started off seeing, I think my reading is seeing Elizabeth as competition, right? So she was jealous of the success, the attention, the relationship. One of the texts that we read in a different portion of the class was a selection from Emily and Amelia Nagoski's Burnout. And one of their arguments is that, like, in a patriarchal society, it's not just that we're seeing men policing women, we're also seeing women policing other women. And we might ask, like, well, why would that be? Women all know what we're up against. Like, we know how hard it is out here. Like, certainly women should have each other's back. But she's arguing that, like, or they're arguing that um, there can be a sense of like, well, if I'm following the rules, you should have to too. And so they use the example of like body shaming and the way that women will body shame other women. It's like, why would that be? But well, turns out like keeping a fit body is extremely demanding, right? It requires often restrictive eating, intense exercise, expensive care routines, right? So if a woman sees another woman who's disregarding those rules, then her instinct is not to be like, good for you, but rather like, get back in line. Like, I'm trying so hard. Why don't you understand what the rules are? I think it's a really compelling argument. I know it's one that I've thought about a lot since reading that. And yeah, I recommend that book. Has such an interesting section on the Haze movement, healthy at every size. So that's a tangent. But the part that's relevant to this relationship, as I saw that with the Frask Elizabeth relationship, is that like Frask saw that Elizabeth wasn't following the rules, and that was a threat. Or like, we all know how this is supposed to work. But once they connected over their traumatic experience, like that allowed them then to help each other heal and witness for each other, right? So I think it's really important that Elizabeth's happy ending came in part through Miss Frask witnessing on her behalf, or like speaking for her. So that was really meaningful to me. In terms of Harriet, then, like I think at least in the book version, Harriet provides like an example of characters needing each other. Like Elizabeth needed to have help with her parenting, right? Like she was drowning with the having the role of both mother and working full time, and she needed that village and she didn't know how to ask for it. And Harriet like helped her ask for it. And it's like sometimes we all need people like that in our lives, right? Like, so that was a really important role. On the flip side, then Harriet needed help getting out of her abusive relationship. And Elizabeth helped give her the strength in order to do that. So it's like they both became stronger through each other. And to have that kind of mutual support is such a cool thing to see in literature. That final scene where Elizabeth quits the show, the TV show, and then she acknowledges her friend, Harriet, that felt like such a big moment for Elizabeth to acknowledge a friendship that she was like learning from, relying on. So that was beautiful. It was different in the TV show. So I don't know how many of you have watched the TV show, but Harriet's an entirely different character. She's still a neighbor, but she has a family. She's younger. She's Black. She has her own plot line where she's pursuing. In the show, they're trying to put a freeway through her neighborhood, and she's arguing against this. Like she's a community activist or organizer. So I think we get a sense of the two characters as like parallel protagonists. And she's fighting her own fights. And this is something I really liked about the TV show. In general, I thought the TV show, again, I missed the narrator. There were other parts I missed. Some of you mentioned 6:30, you missed less, you wanted more 6:30. But I think the Harriet plotline was a really smart one, because how can you possibly write a story about the 1950s or 60s and not mention the civil rights movement? And so to have that intersectional conversation about like to be a woman, to be a Black woman, and what kind of fights does that raise for you? Yeah, I think the novel could have benefited from that, and it was cool to see the TV show tell that story or think about that.
I think the comments also echo that as well. Shouting out Ava, she said that she didn't really like Miss like Frask within the book, but really liked her in the TV show. It seems that's like a general theme that they preferred the character evolution within the TV show compared to the novel as well for Harriet and for Miss Frask with developing a more positive relationship. There's a scene in the TV show where they're like laughing together, and you get a little bit more friendship within the book, but you don't have that explicitly seen.
Yeah, good.
I
Yeah,
guess
I'm
just
really
related to
appreciating
that.
the comments in the chat. Yeah, good.
Yeah. Would you recommend people watch the TV show after everything you just said?
If you have an Apple TV subscription, I would be like, sure, go for it. See what you like. It's interesting always to compare TV and books. But if you don't already have, I wouldn't be like, get it for this kind of thing. I think read the book again, and then you'll, yeah, that's what I'd say.
Lane brought out that she was thinking a lot about like civil rights movement and
Yeah.
its tee off to the second wave feminist movement. Seemed the TV show brought in a whole other consideration of the movement.
That's so great. Yeah, thanks, Lane. You're totally right.
Relating to the TV show, STV is like a form of entertainment. So
Yeah.
novel also is like a form of entertainment as well. But should we take these forms of entertainment seriously? Or is this just a social commentary that it's speaking about? Or is this something that actually matters?
Yeah, good, good. Sorry, I'm looking at those shout outs to Ted Lasso in the chat. Love it. Yeah, this was a question that I got from, I think Teresa, I see that you're in the chat. So uh, shout out to Teresa, who is asking sort of the relationship between like, is this novel just entertainment or should we be taking it seriously? Like, is it a social commentary? And that's, I think, so central to almost the whole theme, one of the big themes of the course I was teaching, and certainly relevant for this text. My answer to that question would be that this may be more than you bargained for, Teresa, but like um that the novel has always been within the US, the novel has always been a subversive form because it does both of these things at the same time, entertainment and social commentary. So for thinking about the novel, I gave you a little history earlier. For thinking about the novel in the US context, novels weren't popular until the 1800s. But even before they were popular, there were cultural authorities, the religious authorities were part of that, who were like denouncing the novel as like a corrupting influence. And this was especially in gendered terms, right? That women should be reading, like you said in the chat, like their Bibles, their tracts, and instead they're reading this fluffy trash. And so it was like it was being criticized for not being serious enough, for just being entertainment light. Often again sexual terms that were in class, and I brought in like a quotation about, your wife starts reading novels, she leaves you for another man, to lure women away from their husbands, the novel. But at the same time, so one of the critiques there is that like, yeah, it's fluffy trash, it's not serious, it's sexual, whatever. At the same time, there's also a critique. So novels are being written not just for women, but by women. It was one of the few careers in the earlier US that like women could hold. So women were using that form in order to challenge status quos, not always directly, but to question the way things were, to give women ideas for how they could be different. And so thinking about those two things going together, it's just fluffy trash, and also it's challenging the status quo that cultural authorities have an investment in, right? Those two things go hand in hand as part of what the novel does. And so if I'm thinking about lessons in chemistry, like yes, and right, both entertainment and serious social commentary. Yeah, and I've seen in the chat, Susan being like, the chick lit terminology, good. It's yeah, and there's the whole Think ND. If any of you haven't followed the Think ND women's work series, there's a whole episode on this. But it's worth thinking about, where did we get this binary of trashy women's literature, chick lit, like dismissive language, and that there's serious literature with social commentary. And that was something that we talked about in the class quite a bit, that like by the mid 1800s, the novel's kind of socially acceptable. At that point, men are like, socially acceptable, you say, maybe I should get my skin in that game. And so men get interested in it almost right away. Then there starts to be kind of a sense of people trying to define, these men trying to define like good literature from trash, popular trash. And that was being done in gender terms right from the start. And we still see that today then. Yeah. I'm looking at the time. We probably have time for one more, Grace. Your call. Which one? Where do you want to go?
Let's go ahead and talk about Calvin. We have not brought him up, so
Yeah,
let's talk about this as a potential love story. Was
good.
not somewhere I saw this going.
Uh-huh.
So the question is, if Elizabeth is such a strong and independent woman, why does Calvin matter so much to the plot?
Yeah, good. So I think I one review that was helpful for my thinking on this. The Washington Post talked about this novel as delivering, quote, several love stories. And I think that's right. So like having to think about the romantic relationship with Calvin as one love story among many, I think changes my own relationship to it. And I think too, checking our own impulse to think that if it's a love story, we should add the word just in front. It's just a love story. It's just a romantic comedy, whatever. That's our own, getting back to the last question, that's our own sort of historically inherited biases, right? So thinking about what she got from that Calvin relationship, right? They challenged each other. And one of the things, to draw on one other text that we talked about in class, um, human giver syndrome. So this comes from philosopher Kate Mann, or maybe it's Mann. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. But she has like this philosophical framework in which people can be divided into, she says, society expects that there's some folks who are human beings who exist in order to achieve, to self-actualize. And then there's folks in the category of human givers, and they exist in order to help the human beings achieve and self-actualize, to give of themselves for that. And our society thinks about women as givers and men as beings. Now, of course, this is a philosophical framework. So she's not saying like this is the way it is, but she's saying our society has constructs around these two kind of poles. So what's the problem with this? Well, if givers take anything from themselves, self-care, trying to achieve a goal, well, that's selfish. Like they're supposed to be the givers. They're supposed to be helping the other people. And then flip side of that, men have the right to take whatever they want, including in the argument that Kate Mann's making, women's bodies, like justification for sexual assault. So this kind of, what's interesting to me about this argument about the human giver syndrome in the context of lessons in chemistry is that like we recognize the way in which both Kelvin and Elizabeth are inhabiting the role of the being and the giver and are helping each other do that. And I think it's a really cool model of how that can work. Not perfectly, they each have their errors, but they're trying to work that out, what that can look like in a society that doesn't generally value that back and forth. So, yeah, that would be my take on the love story. And just one, I guess, other note, one of the things, well, no, I'll end there because I don't want us to go over. Very observant, very punctual.
Kiki, calling out like one chat had a really good point that she was nervous that the love story is something that was going to hold back Elizabeth or hurt the storyline. She said it wasn't until she reflected further that she realized a love story doesn't have to diminish any of her accomplishments, and it may have been Kiki's own assumptions or biases that planted the thought in her head in the first place.
Cool. Neat. Well, I want to thank folks. Grace, thank you first so much for talking with me through this, co-hosting with me tonight. Kelsey and Grace Morrison, who are behind the scenes making the tech work great. And then last but not least, of course, to all of you, thank you for spending your, 80 of you spending your Wednesday evening thinking alongside, talking about books. Like, again, it's just such a gift to talk about text and community. And in this like divisive time, to be able to just sit together with a text and think about what it's trying to teach us is so beautiful. And so, yeah, thank you for being here. If you have additional questions for me, my email address is on the Notre Dame. It's easy to find online, the Notre Dame website. So happy to hear from you. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone.